Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Malini, and I'm speaking to you today from Western Sydney University's Institute for Culture and Society. I am sitting by the Parramatta, the Burramata River. I pay my respects to the Daru Elders, past, present, and emergent. And I welcome you to ICS's Key Concepts lecture series for 2024. It's my honor and a real privilege to introduce Professor Gail Hawkins. All of you know her work in discard studies and her amazing contributions to the study of politics and materiality. She brings a combination of methodological insights and intellectual rigor into the study of waste. Her work cuts across several disciplines: sociology, cultural studies, science, technology studies, and indeed, she is internationally renowned for her work on waste. The Ethics of Waste is a classic, and I'm sure most of you have read that book, and it really inspired, the field of discard studies. But today is also very special for me for another reason. Professor Hawkins was my mentor when I arrived in this country and to take up a position at Western Sydney University. And it was such a privilege to be in conversation with her intellectually, but also otherwise. I was a new parent and, struggling with balancing parenting and my scholarly life. And she was just the most amazing mentor I could have asked for. So over to Professor Gail Hawkins on the politics of waste.
Hi everyone, my name's Gay Hawkins, and today I want to talk to you about the idea of waste as a political material. And I'll just share my screen with you now. Okay, so what does it mean to think about waste as a political material? Well, that's the driving question of this talk today. And really, I just got sort of four key aims. I want to think about the relationship between materials and politics. And I want to use waste to do that. Now, you might think, well, why pick waste? Well, it's actually a really rich sort of concept in which to understand how politics are materialized and the ways in which materials play an active role in provoking various political processes and situations. But it's also because there's a whole lot of fantastic new thinking going on around waste at the moment, and that's been in play for about 20 years. I wrote a book called The Ethics of Waste in 2006, and since then there's been a huge upsurge in intellectual interest in exploring what is waste across many, many disciplines. For a long time, waste used to be seen as the preserve of engineers or environmental studies. Now there is an incredible amount of great and innovative thinking going on about waste in geography, science and technology studies, anthropology, cultural studies. Waste is obviously forcing a lot of thought. And I think one of the reasons for that is that it's a category that's central to theories of value. It's a category that's central to any understanding of material culture. And today I want to explore how it's a category that's actually central to understanding political processes. So the second aim of the talk is to shift away from the idea of waste as an environmental problem or crisis. That is kind of the idea that waste is just passive, dead, bad material that needs to be removed, eliminated, managed, to the idea of waste and wasting as processes that configure politics in different ways. So waste and processes of wasting can generate these really interesting and critically important political dynamics. So that's what we want to think about, the ways in which waste is implicated in political processes and the ways in which waste can come to shape and craft those politics in very interesting ways. So that means we're also interested in how politics are materialized. A lot of the time when we think about politics, we think about big P politics, discourse, conflicting interests, geopolitics, wars, nation states. But when we put waste into the picture, we're really looking more at issues of micropolitics, the politics of everyday life, and the dynamics whereby things become driven by conflict or change, or simply just direct our conducts and habits in particular ways. So we've got a much wider and richer notion of what politics is beyond our normal understanding of what happens on the news every night. Intellectually, I'm really coming to you from a background in cultural studies, science and technologies studies, political philosophy, and waste or discard studies, where I've been working for most of my career. So the idea of political materials is also a really, really interesting concept. This emerged around about 2010, when a lot of political philosophers started to think, well, how come waste is kind of having an impact on all these other disciplines, but not politics? Or not just waste, but material thinking is really transforming debates across many, many humanities disciplines. So what does it mean for political theory and political philosophy? So that's when a whole sort of upsurge of interest emerged in the relationships between political processes and material processes. And the focus has been on how materials can acquire capacities to provoke or shape political processes in certain situations. I guess another way of putting this is what is the role of non-human stuff in political processes? It's not just stuff that humans have to manage. It's often a very dynamic and active element in political processes, because the stuff of the world is very much talking back to us at the moment. Look at the climate, look at floods, look at accumulating waste matter. These things are making their presence felt. They are really driving how political processes have to be organised. So when you sort of think about a concept like political materials, you are really recognising that you need to think differently about what counts as politics and what are materials. How can they not just be political problems, but how can they also be considered as political participants or political actants? And what happens when you put those two together? When you put politics and materials together, both concepts change quite significantly. So I want to sort of work through these sort of interesting argument using three different examples of different political processes with waste. The first example I want to consider is the rise of recycling. We'd all be familiar with that. We'd all be sorting our waste one night of the week and putting it in the right bins. But recycling is a relatively recent phenomenon. And it certainly has changed human relationships with their rubbish. And it's a perfect example of what we might call mundane governance. So that's one type of politics that waste provokes. The second example I want to look at is the decision in 2013 in New York City to ban polystyrene. So this was a huge controversy that generated a massive amount of media and conflict and public debate, pretty classic sort of political situation in a way. But it's a really good example of how you need to shift from the idea of matters of fact to matters of concern, to use Bruno Latour's very, very interesting and compelling idea of how to think about the relationship between politics and materials. And the third example I want to look at relates to a project I've been working on the circular economy. And it's about trying to eliminate single-use plastics and developing reuse economies. So really it's about how waste is really great for thinking with and experimenting with and inventing different futures. So it's about waste as a provocation for making different worlds. And for me, that is also very much about what politics is. So let's move on to our first example, recycling and the idea of mundane governance. And I take this term from a beautiful book by Steve Woolgar and Daniel Nyland called Mundane Governance. But when I wrote my book on the ethics of waste in 2006, recycling was one of the case studies. And I really just tracked how the recycling dispositif emerged. I tracked it historically in the sense of when and why did recycling emerge. And it was part of the whole 1970s kind of waste crisis where I guess waste was really making its presence felt. There was a sense of sort of accumulating waste all around the world in advanced economies. And there was a sense that, it was no longer possible to simply remove waste, dump it, just pretend, out of sight, out of mind, that rather than having this sort of technocratic approach to waste, which is just simply about disappearing it, it was really now was the time to manage waste. And that meant a whole different set of arrangements between infrastructures, households, everyday practices, and everything from how products were labelled to how our waste was collected. So this was really about the rise of, I guess, a new ethical awareness in humans and particularly consumers about what happened to their waste after they chucked it in the bin. So in order to introduce recycling, a whole set of processes had to take place, which was educating people about the waste crisis, showing them horrifying images of landfills and dumps, and saying that we need to have a different relationship to the stuff that we want to discard, and we need to take a different set of responsibilities to it, and we need to introduce new conducts in the minor practice of putting out the garbage. So that was a huge amount of work on the part of sort of reconfiguring how we understood waste, and then introducing a whole range of new technical devices like new bins, like the classic recycling logo, in order to make households sort their waste rather than just dump it, and to classify it and put it in the right place. Now, of course, this could only happen if there were various accountability regimes put in place to explain to householders why this was necessary, to give them a kind of effective reasoning to justify new habits and conducts. So you can't introduce a new kind of political rationality around waste unless the justification for it is made meaningful to the people who are going to be implicated in that rationality. So accounting for these new practices was very, very important. And that's why, as I've mentioned, education and discussion about the need for recycling was all central to making householders more ethically aware and more ethically implicated in what they had previously just chucked out without even thinking about it. So what we can see here is this whole recycling dispositif, this arrangement of technical devices, new sorts of forms of accountability and reasoning, new sorts of habits and conducts, all had the effect of significant social change. And we can think about this as an example of the way governing happens at the most ordinary and mundane levels of everyday life. It is shaping and influencing our everyday habits and practices, how we think about stuff, how we apprehend waste, and it's often resisted. Certainly there was a lot of argument and complaint about recycling when it was introduced. There were people who didn't want to do it, who couldn't see the point of it. But these are the micro politics that were generated through recycling and that waste materials were actively implicated in. So if we see here a hand putting a plastic bottle in the right bin, we can see how the human, the bottle, and the bin are all interconnected and they're all governing each other in a sense. The bin is sort of scripting and directing that human to do the right thing. The bottle is saying to that human, you can't just chuck me on the ground anymore or chuck me in the landfill bin. I've got a new set of sort of ethical pressures that I'm putting on you. So this sort of complex arrangement and interaction between all those elements is a beautiful example of mundane governance, governing at the most micro level of everyday life. And you can see how it's deeply materialized by the sort of new sorts of pressures that plastic bottle has now acquired and the ways in which the bin itself is directing and governing and inviting and scripting that human to change their behavior. Now, the second example I wanted to talk about was about banning a very, very hazardous and toxic material, polystyrene. And this is an example of politics as conflict and controversy. And it's also an example of how we need to shift from an idea of politics as a dispute over which facts are right to politics as a process of identifying what are the matters of concern in this particular situation. So in 2013, the New York City government decided to ban polystyrene. And this was because it had become a huge problem in the city. It was a very recalcitrant material. It was very light. It was very mobile. It was very, very difficult, if not impossible, to recycle. It was moving around all over the city because it would just blow away. And it was, growing in terms of the amount because fast food economies are just continually expanding. So there was just, a growing sort of debate within New York about the problem of polystyrene. And the mayor basically started to signal to that population, we need to ban polystyrene. We can live without it. It is generating all these impacts and effects that the technocratic infrastructures cannot actually manage, that the waste material is evading those processes. It is recalcitrant. So we need to, therefore, enact a political ban. Now, this generated huge conflict and controversy within New York, and it really brought up a fascinating sort of array of competing understandings of polystyrene. So what you saw then was a very vigorous and vicious debate in the media about different groups and their relationship to polystyrene. So, the waste collectors and the city government said, we hate polystyrene, we want to get rid of it as a waste material, it is toxic and uncontrollable. The American Chemicals Association said, there's nothing wrong with polystyrene, if we're going by environmental audits, it's a low water, a low energy material to produce, so we could consider it as environmentally sound. Retailers said, how can you get rid of this essential takeaway container material? This will destroy our businesses. And consumers said, oh, well, how can we get our coffee if you're not going to allow us to use polystyrene? Our fingers are going to burn. So you can see here that there's all these competing ways of apprehending polystyrene, different experiences of the material, different relationships to it, different effects of the material in different settings. The material is multiple. So we could say here then that what politics does is figure out which facts are right. But as Latour would say, that's just a waste of time. All those facts are equally significant according to who's presenting them. What we need to do is see politics as a process of negotiating and debating matters of concern, whereby all the people and elements that are gathering around polystyrene sit down and say, which elements of polystyrene are we going to be most concerned about? Is it the economic aspects in the sense that it's supporting huge takeaway economies, or is it the environmental aspects where we can see that it's toxic and contaminating? So this polystyrene generated a political situation. And what happened in that situation was the matters of concern about polystyrene were negotiated, and while there was contestation and conflict, what had to be identified and resolved was which of those facts and elements are we going to be most concerned about? Which aspects of this material are going to matter most in this situation? And that was the political process that came into play. And that's how we can understand how the material was actively making its presence felt in that political situation. And it had different advocates, different spokespeople discussing different elements of its material reality. And all of those elements were negotiated in order to identify which ones are most concerning, which impacts are we going to care about most here? Economic impacts, environmental impacts, consumer benefits, or whatever. That is a political situation in which the material is actively participating and making its presence felt. And the many different aspects of that material, its multiple realities, are recognised and all come into play, and they are negotiated. Okay, so the final example I wanted to talk about was the idea of politics as creating different futures, politics as experimenting with the kind of world we want to have rather than trying to, manage the world that is present. So it's about the creative experimental dynamics of imagining different worlds and creating and crafting those worlds. So this is where the idea of, or the problem of single-use plastics come into play. Because in many of these sort of small businesses that I've been looking at in a current research project, there is a focus not on recycling these very problematic and prolific materials, but on figuring out how can we live without them? What kind of economies and everyday lives and practices will we need if we eliminated these materials? If rather than managing waste at the end of the pipe, we prevented it at the beginning, and we thought with waste and the possibility of waste, we took that as a provocation that would force us to design a different set of relationships and economies. So designing out waste is also often called elimination design, is about thinking with waste and how to stop allowing it to happen and how to stop things getting to waste. So it's a really interesting and different approach, completely antithetical to recycling. It's starting at the beginning of a process rather than at the end. So in one of the organisations that I looked at called Returner, which is offering a small business in Melbourne where people can buy online using reusable containers. And in this system, when you order your goods online, they come in stainless steel containers. They're left on your doorstep, and when you're finished with them and you make another order, you just put those containers back on your doorstep. They're collected, they're cleaned, and they recirculate around amongst all the subscribers. So developing a reusable system that eliminates single-use plastics and throwaway containers and instead has reusable containers shifts from the idea of the virtuous consumer who's going to recycle to how can we design a different market and a different set of arrangements and networks between the wholesaler, the retailer, the delivery truck, the household, the collector, the washing up system. How can we develop a different market logistics that allows that reusable container to stay active, to circulate, and to be reused in order to avoid it getting to waste? So what's really happening in this sort of small business is a focus on reuse value, and how to create reuse value. And that involves reuse value isn't found just in the stainless steel container because it's durable. It's found in all the relationships and practices and circuits that container moves through, and all the human and non-human elements that allow it to keep circulating. So to create reuse value, you have to have delivery trucks that can handle these sort of containers. You have to have consumers that are willing to clean them out a little bit and put them back on their doorstep. The sort of small business has to have an infrastructure in place to clean those containers. So it has to have, industrial washing up facility. The wholesaler has to be prepared to change its systems so that it will fill up these containers rather than just use plastic. So there's so many different elements involved in keeping that reusable container alive and allowing it to be reused and keep circulating. And all those elements are generating reuse value. And they are enacting durability, not disposability. And they are eliminating waste in this system. So what you're seeing here is you're creating a different time for the material or the packaging container, a time in which it is in a process of eternal return and circulation, rather than take, make, waste, end of value, repeat. So you can see here that reusable containers are not just a material object, they're a network and an arrangement of very complex relations in which human and non-human elements are all committed and working towards the idea of reuse as circulation. So that's a really, really interesting example of creating a future without single-use plastics, of stopping disposability by redesigning markets and materials and imagining and generating a different way in which we could organise shopping and containerisation. So it's making a future that we want if we want to save the world from the huge burden of single-use plastics. Okay, so here you can see the owner of Returner saying that recycling is rubbish because recycling is focused on the fact of waste and what to do with it, whereas Returner is focused on avoiding waste, refusing that possibility, taking up the provocation of not having waste in an economy and figuring out what material elements and relationships need to be in place to enable that. So just to conclude, I hope you've seen from this talk that waste is implicated in different sorts of politics, the most mundane forms of governance, controversies, and negotiations over matters of concern, and making experimental futures. All those are fascinating examples of different sorts of political processes. And they show you that waste is an actant, as Latour would say, or a participant in shaping these processes. It's actively involved in crafting and generating new sorts of relationships, practices, habits, infrastructures. The other point I'd make in conclusion is there is no singular politics of waste. Waste becomes political, I hope you can see from this talk today, in any number of different ways. Politics, like waste, are emergent processes that can take different sorts of forms according to different situations. The other point about the idea of political materials is that they foreground the more than human worlds that we live in. Politics is always more than human. It involves not just devices and many other sort of non-human elements, but the world is also speaking back to us, and it is demanding and forms of engagement and political processes that recognise that it speaks. And in these examples, I hope you can see how politics is more than human, and in different ways, waste speaks through different sorts of political processes. Thanks a lot.